Let's go in the talking room.
Damon, thanks so much for coming on the talking room.
It is my pleasure.
I appreciate you letting us tear apart your office a little bit.
That's what it's here for.
In film school, we used to have this saying that if a friend of yours asks you if he can film in your house, he is not your friend.
That was film school.
That was film school. You tore apart everyone's apartments.
Everybody's, yes. Yeah. And you knew that, it was yours this week, but whoever had torn it apart, you would get sweet vengeance the following week.
Right. You're going to tear apart their kitchen to make it the homeless.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to put signs like up on certain bathrooms, like not for crew use, and that's where you could shit.
I remember dressing somebody's kitchen to look like it was really sloppy, and his mom came home and freaked out on all of us.
My mom made Big Ziti for the entire crew.
Really?
Yeah. So she was much more supportive.
So where did you go to film school?
I went to NYU.
Okay, that's where I went there. I think a little earlier.
I think I'm still in debt. Just about to pay off my final college loans.
All my friends were at NYU, and even though I dropped out, I kind of got the ersatz education by working on all their films for 5 years.
Yeah, that's the way to do it is to drop out after a year, because you get to say that you went to NYU film school, but you don't have to be in debt until you're 40 years old.
Exactly.
And walking around with my film degree, that's so impressive in Los Angeles. It's like, I bring it with me to the ArcLight so that I just, I get preferential treatment, and people really want to know after the movie's over. They'll come up to me because I'm holding my film degree. They'll come up and they'll say, "What was All Is Lost a good movie?" And I'll say, Let's go talk about it.
I can discuss such major themes, but I'll need a laser pointer.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So you are really busy right now. You've got a couple of things in the hopper, right?
Yeah, really busy always feels like a lament. So in this case, it's not. I think it's awesome. The big shift has been entering back into the episodic television world with The Leftovers. So we've been writing since the beginning of October. And that has just been a wild shift away from what the 3 previous years were in the, Lost finished in 2010. And so just the movie life, while I would try to convince people that I was busy, what it really amounted to was, 3 to 4 hours a day of actual work, and then the rest of the time goofing around on the internet and going and seeing movies and reading books and spending time with my family, who I had neglected in the 6 years that Lost was on, building goodwill towards when that time would come again, and that time is now. And then there were brief periods over the course of those 3 years where I would very intensively focus on a writing project for a month. But for the most part, it was like a pretty any screenwriter who tells you that their life is hard. The work is hard, but the hours are awesome. And now I'm back into a regimented 70-hour week. Just basically focused on The Leftovers. And then in addition to that, Tomorrowland, which Brad Bird is directing currently, in this week they're in Florida, but mostly out of Vancouver. I've been kind of going back and forth to there as I can.
And you were co-writer of Tomorrowland and one of the producers.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so those are two very different hats.
They are.
And you've bounced back and forth between them a whole bunch. Is there one that you prefer? Do you like the oscillation?
Any hat with a feather in it, really, or those miniature hats that you were telling me about. I want to get my hands on. But I think the great thing about Tomorrowland is Brad Bird is really the showrunner. This guy Jeff Jensen and I kind of hashed out the story. Then Bird that got Bird involved. Then he and I wrote multiple drafts of it, and then I was really actively involved in prepping the movie. But once we went into production, it's just Brad's vision, and so there's as huge of a control freak as I am. When you work with somebody like Brad or J.J. Abrams, you can just kind of step back and say hey, I'm here if there's anything you need me to do. I'm going to be watching the dailies and sending you emails about how incredibly talented you are. But at that point, what am I going to tell Brad Bird about how to do his job?
But does that happen? Does he call up and say, I've run into a block here with something that doesn't make sense, and can we fix it?
Yeah, infrequently. I think more more likely there'll be an issue, we get behind, or there's stunt blocking that we wrote in the script that when you actually get there on the day isn't going to make sense. So he'll call and say, I wanted to cut this, or I had this idea to do that, or but mostly he functions more or less autonomously, and if he wants to change stuff on the day, he certainly doesn't need to call me. When he does, it's a courtesy. But we talk many times over the course of the week, but we're also dealing with all these issues that aren't just about the work that he's doing that day, but just we're both producing the movie, so any issue that's budgetary or cast-wise, the release date of the movie just got moved. So we were going to be Christmas of 14. Now we're Memorial Day of 15 because Star Wars moved off of Memorial Day and onto Christmas of 15. So we were talking a lot last week about that.
I mean, I guess one of the things that I think a lot of people are jealous of you, we live in a culture where people walk out of a movie and immediately start discussing its primary themes and the places that the script went wrong, but you frequently get to sit in the room and discuss.
I get to write the scripts
those
that go
big
wrong.
Themes.
Yes.
Those right, and specifically, like there are times when you're collaborating, but also when you're coming in to fix something, coming in to adjust something. And I'm kind of fascinated by stepping into World War Z. Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about that. Like they'd already shot a whole movie.
Yes.
And then they called you, and you've got to come into a room where everyone's been like eating, sleeping, and breathing this thing for years.
Right.
And they say, please tell us how to tear this apart and put it back together?
It feels like a lot less regimented than that. I mean, I think that as much as I'd love to cast myself in the role of savior or script doctor or any of those other glamorous titles, the way that these things happen is much more organic, which is it is very common in the we'll call them tentpole movies or blockbuster movies, these big $100 million plus movies. There's so many moving parts for things to go astray or off track. Mm-hmm. And I've never been involved with one where that didn't happen. And in the case of World War Z, I had just started getting wind as a fan, having been a huge acolyte of Max Brooks's book, just was sort of tracking the movie closely, just started to get wind of the fact that, oh, wait a minute, they pushed the release date back. There must be trouble, like in River City. And just the idea that Brad Pitt was going to star in it, did that mean that it wasn't going to be episodic in nature? And Michael Straczynski, who had written an early draft, was replaced by Matt Carnahan, who's an amazing writer. So you're just like, okay, so what is the state of the union on this thing? And then suddenly the veil is lifted for you, and you get a phone call. Brad and his producers, Dee Dee Gardner and Jeremy Kleiner, want to sit down with you and talk about World War Z.
So I'm interested in the actual mechanics.
Yeah.
So they call you and say, we want to set up a phone call. Are you familiar with the material? Can we talk about it?
Yeah, my agent called me and essentially said, do you want to meet with Brad Pitt? And that was the opening salvo. And I was like,
the answer to that question is always yes.
It's always going to be yes, absolutely. Even if it's just to be beat up by him.
Yeah, exactly.
I will do that. And so I said, yes, I would love to meet with him. Do you know what it's about? And my agent said, I think it's about World War Z, but I'm unclear on that. And
they're of course trying to keep wraps on any kind of
and I think like even inside the agency, like everybody's being very quiet. And when I went, I had to sign an NDA, which I don't even want to violate now. So I'll speak in I'll speak in generalities. But yeah, I went to Brad's house and met with him in his office with his producing partners. And essentially what they said was, we finished this movie, we've been editing it for a couple months now, and the ending isn't working. And we would love for you to take a look at it and help us out.
And they have a clear idea about why they think the ending doesn't work.
Yes, but they didn't share that with me at the time. Okay. They felt like at the time that, as you said, there are all these people who have basically living, breathing, executing World War Z for 2 years by their accounting, the development process probably longer. but they wanted fresh eyes
Yeah.
and someone who was completely going to just look at the patient and diagnose, oh, well, your problem isn't cancer. It's just an infection. Like, and I've done that job a number of times, and you almost never get credited, and nobody ever knows you've done it.
Right.
Like, it's a very fairly common thing that happens where a movie is there are just a couple things that aren't working about it, so they'll bring in somebody to look at it to diagnose the problem. Sometimes the solution is just purely editorial: lose this scene, lose that scene, move this scene here, and you're good to go. Sometimes it requires what used to be called reshoots and are now called additional photography, because that's exactly. You're not dying, you're life challenged.
It's what shell shock has moved all the way to PTSD.
Yeah, sure, exactly. So you will recommend some additional photography, and when I've done this job before on other movies, it's you need this scene, or you need to shoot a couple scenes, so it's like a day or two of principal photography. So I thought that's what was going to be one of those, because the reason that I get that call is because I've done this a couple of times, and Prometheus was not a case of that. That was, I came in at the scripting phase.
Right.
This is the movie has already been shot phase. So it's sort of like the studio's not the studio doesn't want to spend a lot more money, so it's basically like you're just kind of crossing T's and dotting I's.
Do you read the script first, or do you watch their cut first?
They didn't want me to. They didn't want me to read any of the materials. I told them that I had read the book and what I liked about the book, and but other than that, they were just. And it was odd because normally you have this meeting after you've seen the movie, and so you say like, "Well, here's what I do." It's an interview. Like they're not saying, "Damon, help us. We need you." They're saying
they want to find out
they're interviewing a number of different writers and soliciting their takes, and the take that they like the most, they'll hire that person. That's usually how it works. This was a little bit different, and I don't know if they talked to anybody else prior to me, but they were like, "We don't want you to read anything. We want you to watch the movie. And then tell us what you think." And so I went and I saw the movie, and I only saw 72 minutes of the movie, so it was roughly an hour and 10 minutes, and the movie ended very abruptly. And so they were like, "So what'd you think?" And I said, "Where's the rest of the movie?" Like I kind of, they're like, "Well, we don't want you to see all that other stuff. If the movie just ended here, what would you do from here?" And I said, "Well, I could answer that question, but I still feel like I need to see what you did so that I don't pitch that, because I have certain instincts, but I also feel like I can learn a lot from what you did and didn't like."
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like if I had been in the Matthew Carnahan position, who's basically the guy who did all the writing to get the movie made and all the writing through it, I would have written exactly what Matthew Carnahan wrote, because when you're writing a movie, you're in service of the producer's and the director's vision. In this case, it was Brad and Dee Dee and Jeremy and Mark Forster. So you're basically you have a voice in that process, but you're doing what makes sense to them. They're your bosses. So so they did show me the original, and I was like, this isn't. Just by virtue of the fact that they only showed me 72 minutes, I knew immediately this was not the job that I had done before, where you say, move this scene, move that scene, and you need to reshoot 2 new scenes.
Right. This
like
is a big fix.
So they showed me what they had shot, and thus began, what ended up being a 1-month process for me, where first off, I had a very limited window of availability because Bird and I were working on the draft of Tomorrowland, and Disney kindly allowed me to basically take this month to go and engage on Z. But I brought in Drew Goddard, who is an amazing writer and director, who we had worked together on Lost, and we essentially partnered up and came up with what our pitch was going to be to them.
Now, are you thinking, when you're thinking of that, are you thinking also in terms of how much money they've got to spend or want to spend, or are you giving them the first thing that you're giving them is just the blue sky, here's what I would do if there were no holds barred?
The first thing that happened was, before Drew came in, I assumed, as it has always been, as you surmise, that the studio isn't going to want to spend a lot of money, and they're going to want to use as much as they as much as you can of what they shot.
Right.
So this version, the 72-minute version, and now just basically write an entirely new ending, I was like, that's never going to fly with Paramount. So now that you've shown me the entire movie, here's a sort of streamed down version of using a lot of that footage and shooting a couple new scenes in order to get through. And then we had a meeting at Paramount, and to their credit, Adam Goodman and sort of the Paramount elite essentially said, "Oh no, we want to do the 72-minute version, and you just write a whole new thing. We're going to throw all that out," which was sort of like, okay, if that's what we're doing, I need to hire someone else because we don't have a lot of time to execute it, and let's go do that. And then Drew and I ended up, writing 60 pages of material.
But this is something that you've talked about a lot is how much you really like collaborating. And you've talked about the process of Lost and Star Trek working with JJ as a very collaborative, creative process among the producers and the writers. Mm-hmm. What is it you get out of the collaborative process? I mean, because people think of screenwriters often as lone scribes pecking away, but you really like this dialogue with a co-writer or with...
Yeah, I mean, first off, I'm not being modest or self-deprecating or like, oh, I'm the luckiest guy in the world, which is true, I am the luckiest guy in the world, but I was smart enough to realize early on that my maximum chance of being successful in this industry that I always wanted to be a part of was, finding really talented people and working with them, because I just didn't feel like I would be successful doing it alone. And I think a lot of people maybe make the mistake of they find early success and incredible collaborations, and then it's like, let's you and I think of like 5 great Mick Jagger songs, just as a solo artist.
Yeah.
Like, no offense to Mick Jagger.
Yeah.
And it's just like, so that's how I broke through. That's how I became successful. That's how I'm going to stay successful. So I find enormously talented people, and I'll stick with them as long as they'll have me. And then I meet new people and circle back, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the collaboration is not only the funnest part of the job for me, but it's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
And my ability to, try to understand what other people want to do and help them realize their visions makes it is a pivotal learning experience for me when as you say, when I'm wearing the other hat or the shoe is on the other foot or whatever clothing metaphor we want to come up with. But like when we're executing my vision, primarily like in the TV sphere, I'm much more able to do that job having been on the other side of it.
So I'm also interested in how it was sitting down and working out Prometheus with Ridley Scott.
Yes.
I mean, sitting across the room from this guy, that has to be... I've just found myself wondering how you would say, actually, I don't like that idea.
Oh, no, you don't. What are you, crazy? First off, he's wearing all that armor.
Right.
Which is, he takes the Sir thing very seriously. It's intimidating. And if and when he lifts the visor, you don't, but seriously. I'm not joking. Incredibly intimidating.
But he's looking to you for ideas and for to take things and run with them. And...
Sure, and it's walking that line of saying, help me understand what it is you want, and then I will prescribe courses of action that will hopefully get you to where you want to go. And if we'll start to take several steps down that road, and then if that's not working for you, I have to be very facile in switching roads. And then there are points where I have to put my foot down and say, I'm not entirely sure that's making sense to me, but never from a point of view of like Ridley, that's moronic.
Right, no,
come on, that's ridiculous. That would never happen in the Alien universe.
Yeah.
Guess what? If Ridley Scott just said it happened in the Alien universe, it just fucking happened in the Alien universe. So, I don't get to be the fanboy, version of myself sitting in the movie theater going like this. I can't be that guy in that room, or I will be fired and replaced. And I know that because I've been fired and replaced. So I have a job which is I can either take the high moral ground, or I can be a professional and try to execute the vision that's put in front of me. And all that being said, I found and I'm not just saying this because this is what you're supposed to say, I found Ridley to be enormously, highly collaborative, and funny and engaging and tough, because great directors are where it's like, he was very honest. If I pitched something that he didn't like, he would tell me so, and then I had to go back to the drawing board. But very, very early on, I got that job. Again, they were auditioning a number of other writers, and it was the same call. Ridley Scott wants to meet with you, and we think that it's about what they were calling Alien Zero at the time, and they want you to read this script. And in that case, I did get the opportunity to read material before I came into the meeting. And you have to, and I also, I'm not saying this because it's what you're supposed to say, but I felt like John Spates, who wrote the draft before I came on, had done an amazing job, and I would have written exactly the same draft, because his job was to write a dyed-in-the-wool Alien prequel with all of the set pieces that we would come to expect, with facehuggers and eggs and xenomorphs and chest bursters and LV-426, and so all of those things were in his version, but they didn't want to make that movie, and so it's a very tricky job, because you basically, it's like The Greatest American Hero. Like, you get the suit, but you don't get the manual.
Right,
so you're like, okay, there's this script that's pretty good. Like, but they're now auditioning me. So what don't they want to do about, like, what is it about this that they don't want? Like, what intelligence can I gather before I can come in? Because if I just come in tomorrow and I basically say, like, this script is incredible, why aren't you shooting this? I'm never going to get the job.
Right.
And they're going to hire somebody else to screw up John Spates' draft. So my job is to basically try to guess what their issue was, and I ended up guessing right, which was that they didn't want it to be married so specifically to the previous Alien films. They wanted to end at the familiar, to end at the facehugger or the xenomorph. But so you basically have 2 hours to fill before that, and so there was this other idea that was embedded in John's script that I thought was really interesting, and that turned out to be what Ridley, and as a huge aficionado of Alien, not to the level that you are, but I had heard Ridley give many interviews over the years saying that that one day he wanted to tell the story of the space jockey.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, well then that's the movie, which is who's the guy in the suit, and sort of marry that to this creation myth. And I really liked the generational idea of, androids being sort of a fixture of what I construed to be the Alien franchise. It's like, okay, there's going to be, these are the things that you have to check off for it to be an Alien movie. And having a robot on board was one of them, and not a Data, next-gen robot that kind of wanted to be human. They were perfectly comfortable being robots. And were sort of disdainful of humans. That's another thing that made it an Alien movie. So I was like, how does that robot character fit into a story about creation? And I was like, that's pretty interesting to me, because humans are looking for their creator, but this guy is basically hanging out with his creators. He's completely unimpressed by them.
Right.
So,
that's the line he says that devastated me was, why did you make me? Because we can. Can you imagine hearing that from your God?
Right, exactly. From your creator, yeah. And and so I came in and I talked a lot about that stuff and kind of bringing that up, but there were also some killer set pieces in John's draft, including the med pod scene where she basically gets this thing out of her after being infected. In John's draft, it was a chest burster that has been put in her via a facehugger, and I was like, if we can just make that, if she can become impregnated, and she gives birth to basically the first face hugger that will essentially create the first chest burster, then maybe that gives us. So that was my pitch in our first meeting, and Ridley liked enough of those ideas to take a flyer on me, and then began, it was like a full year of my life basically just working on the Prometheus draft. Like you said, he wasn't like, do it and then come back and we'll talk. We sat across the table from each other for 6 weeks.
Wow.
Going scene by scene by scene on what it was he wanted to do. And then I was like, I got it. And then I would, I'd knock out my draft in, 2 or 3 weeks. And then we would repeat the process.
Were there strengths that you were surprised by that he brought to the table? Things that, I mean, I find myself wondering if, like, you've been a fan of his for so long.
Yes.
And he sits down and he has an insight and you're like, oh, okay, now I get why you're Ridley Scott. I see that. I mean, there must be a ton of those moments.
Yeah, you get why he's Ridley Scott right out of the gate.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, it does take you just try not to call him anything because you don't want to call him Ridley. You just want to call him Mr. Scott or Sir Ridley, because you are in the presence of greatness. And although he's, you know, he doesn't want you to treat him that way. I remember basically, like, we'd been working together for about a week, and then we were like eating lunch, and he started talking about Blade Runner, and I was like, okay, well, you know,
this is
you
happening.
opened the door. Let's talk about Blade Runner, and so he was talking about it, and then as opposed to asking him the 50 million questions that I wanted to, having seen every single edition of Blade Runner there is, and I already know, I'm already privy to a lot of what his answers to those questions are. I just said to him, Ridley, before I even dive in on this, I have to tell you what my experience was watching Blade Runner, and what a master. And as soon as I said the word masterpiece, he just sort of waved me off and was like, just shut the fuck up. I don't, you know, he got really uncomfortable and embarrassed and sweet, and like, I could tell, like, he didn't want me to
That's not the level
sit there
on which he
and
wants
like
to talk about
praise
it.
him, which
Right.
I was like, well, I wanted to do that for 20 minutes. It's like, he just wants me to treat him, well, obviously like my boss, but
Right.
he doesn't want me to treat him like Ridley Scott. And I don't know if I can do my job well if I venerate him
Right.
too much. But yes, constantly, I would he'd be talking, and he is an artist. Not just the
wonderful
traditional artist,
yeah.
but an artist. And he'd just be drawing, and I'd be like, if he is going to the bathroom, I am so grabbing that shit and stuffing it in my backpack. Like, which I never did, by the way, Ridley. I don't know anything that you did. But like, his napkin drawings are like,
Yeah.
could be in the Met. You know,
Oh, I
they're
love his.
insane.
I mean, I
Yeah.
crawled over his storyboards and all that. So one of the things that I love about your work is how much you love your characters. It's really clear over the course to me that you really want the best for all of your characters, even the bad guys. You want the best to happen for them. And you shot this summer The Leftovers, which is
Yep.
from Tom Perrotta's book. And he is admittedly dark with his characters.
Indeed,
And
yeah.
he's written a whole bunch of very dark ones over the course of his career. So what is that like when you sit down with him? Do you guys end up in conflict about that, or do you end up showing him other sides of his characters? I mean, you have two different approaches.
Yeah, it's a new, this is a new kind of collaboration, certainly in the TV sphere, because there's it's an adaptation. There's pre-existing material. That's Tom's book. And so not only is the premise of the show his, which is essentially, the rapture happens. The biblical evangelical rapture that
All the way down to like piles of smoking clothes on the ground?
No, I mean
okay.
that's it's the only context that people have. So 2% of the world's population spontaneously disappears, and they don't leave their clothes behind. Like, so if you disappeared, I would just be looking at an empty chair right now. Anything that's in contact with your person would be gone along with you. And it's approximately like 140 or 150 million people disappear spontaneously. So that's a very large number, but it's 1 out of every 50 people. So it's not, the odds of you losing an immediate family member are not high, but
Yeah.
those are plague numbers. I mean, so it's a destabilizing event, and even more destabilizing is it doesn't appear to be the biblical rapture in which all good people or all Christians
Or all
are all
religious,
called
right.
up to heaven. It seems to be completely and totally arbitrary. So there's some real assholes that disappear. So the Pope disappears, but also like a convicted rapist on death row. And so everyone's trying to build a Venn diagram where they understand what the selection criteria was, but more importantly, like, how low was the bar that I didn't clear it?
Right.
You're already dealing with a population of people who are sort of wondering, what did I do to deserve this? But more importantly, it sort of creates this massive sort of theological and emotional state of being, and fundamentally focused on confusion, which is what the hell are we supposed to do now? And the real genius of Tom's book is that it starts 3 years after this thing happened.
Right.
So you're not in the immediate aftermath of chaos. It's sort of like it's a post-apocalyptic story where you look outside your window and it doesn't look like the apocalypse has happened. Because after 3 years, people are like, all right, there was a lot of rioting and government instability, but I guess I gotta go to work and like pay my taxes and like, drive my kids to school, like, because I haven't received further instructions and the Antichrist has not risen up and 2% of the world's population, maybe we get like a temporary reprieve on carbon emissions, but it hasn't been that impactful.
And 3 years is long enough for you to also kind of be like, I'm not sure if that really happened like that.
Yes, and on a micro level, the show basically just takes place in this one town in New York, the suburb of New York City, and it focuses on this
which
family.
Town? I grew up in a suburb of New York.
We made it up. It's called Mapleton. It's New Jersey in the book, but for tax purposes, it is New York in the adaptation.
Is Mapleton on the Hudson?
It is on the Hudson.
It's
Mapleton
could be Tarrytown.
Mapleton. It could be. It could be Nyack.
Okay.
Hastings.
Yeah.
Any one of the many real towns that we shot the show in. But it's Mapleton for the purposes of not pissing anyone off and getting sued, I guess.
Yeah.
But and it's just about this town, how they're dealing with life. So there's this huge genre element, supernatural element that predated the show itself, but the show is just kind of, it's like Friday Night Lights. And since Peter Berg directed it, when I first met with Tom Parada, and he writes just these really great kind of suburban, kind of John Cheever, tongue-in-cheek, John and Cheever, tongue-in-cheever, whatever, sort of stories about dark individuals. I kind of always felt like tonally the show was going to be, because Lost is storytelling that drives me. It's existential genre where it's sort of like this one of the jumping off points for me creatively. Obviously, I've talked ad nauseum about Star Wars, so let's just assume that that's the bedrock of all great things ever in the history of anything.
I'll go with you on that.
But Close Encounters was the other one where essentially Roy Neary, who's saying like, this means something. I was so captivated by that idea that became a part of all the storytelling that I really love. This plane must have crashed for a reason.
Right.
That Lockean construct. So this idea of a world that was like, why did this thing happen? Where did these people go? Why didn't I go? And then but now we cut to 3 years later. That's where the show starts, and they're sort of like, what if I'm not going to get that answer?
Right.
That really plugged into all the things that I was experiencing post-Lost, where there was a vocal response to, you didn't give us answers to the mysteries. It's like, well, wait a minute, like we answered what happens when you die, but we didn't tell you like why Walt was special. Okay, but I am interested in those sort of larger theological questions embedded in genre, and Tom was serving it up with this brilliant premise. So because it was scaled so small, because it's just about, okay, now what are we supposed to do? What's happening in this town now, in this world that feels very much like our own, but there aren't zombies walking around. There isn't a huge mushroom cloud off in the distance. Like, Viggo Mortensen isn't like digging for a can of Coke. It's post-apocalyptic, but
it's the most disappointing apocalypse possible.
Exactly. It's sort of like this very mundane apocalypse.
With the strap guns on.
And I just love the idea, and and Tom and I started having conversations about how to turn his book, which is very much a novel. It's not the first in a series.
Right.
The Left Behind series, the Tim LaHaye series, deals with the real biblical rapture, and it's a very popular series of books. This is sort of the anti-Left Behind. Sort of like, hey, they were left behind. Left behind, we're the leftovers. But it's like, it's kind of got to be more exciting than that, because people aren't going to want to watch that show.
Have you already thought through what you think the arc of the show might be, or are you letting that develop as you go? I would assume.
The answer is, I'm thinking more about where this show is going to go than I've ever thought about it before, for all the obvious reasons. That said, I also have to let the show organically tell us what it wants to be.
Once it starts to air, once the actors find their level, the audience finds its level with it.
I really believe, and I've had the pleasure of hanging out with Vince Gilligan, as I know you have, and he sort of like openly just says like, oh yeah, like we just showed like Walt getting that gun out of that trunk, and we didn't know what the hell he was going to use it for, and part of you goes like, you liar, you deceiver, and the other part of you goes like, that's good. You had faith that the show was going to tell you what Walt was going to use it for, and what's the matter with that? Yeah. Now, when you're working in a mystery show, versus what's going to happen to Walter White, but when you're throwing out specific mysteries, like, why did the plane crash? Mm-hmm. You can't do it that way because you have to have an answer to the mystery at the time that you present the mystery, or else I really do believe it is a cheat. Yeah. So it's letting certain things in the show develop organically in the AK in the trunk kind of way, but the mysteries do have to have clearly defined responses, and I do feel like I'm figuring out that balance, but I think I'd go crazy if I presented mysteries in the leftovers that I did not have clearly defined answers for.
Yeah, I asked Vince about the lock that he kills Crazy 8 with. And I was like, that's one of the most beautiful little constructions I've ever seen. Is that it's this simple device, it works so well, it's humiliating because of how simple it is, and then it also allows Walt to kill him without looking at him.
Right.
And Vince is like, oh yeah, our set dresser just put it on the table, it seemed perfect.
Right, and and that's the beauty of it, is how comfortable he is with this idea that I talk about all the time, and I think that Vince subscribes to, and most of the people whose stuff I love also subscribe to, which is a television show or a story. Let's just say a story, but particularly in TV, I feel, because it's told over such a long period of time, is an organic living thing, like a child, where you can't have your child and say, you are going to be, the starting pitcher for the Oakland A's, and I'm going to do everything that I can to curate that ability in you. So I'm going to put a ball in your hand, and you're going to start gripping it as a newborn, and then you're going to have a pitching coach as of 2. Right. And I'm just going to put you in front of the TV, and all you're going to watch is baseball. If your kid doesn't want to be a pitcher, they're not going to be a pitcher. So there will come a point where, for every Tiger Woods, who basically that process did happen to, his dad said, not only am I genetically a golfer, I'm going to curate golfer in you. There's literally 100,000 kids who had golf clubs forced into their hands, who are basically like, fuck you, Dad, I'm going to be a ballerina. Right. And the key is recognizing that point where your kid drops the ball and saying, all right, that's not working, we're going to do something else. But shows literally reject ideas, like bodies reject organs that are of different blood types.
Well, and Vince was saying that they ran through, he said, when we figured out the ending, we ran through every possible scenario. We killed everybody at some point.
Absolutely.
So when you're trying to have respect for that organic process, that's kind of antithetical to the way the network wants things to go, right? I mean, they would love 100 scripts up front. And to feel like, okay, this is going to work.
Right.
I mean, that I know that you didn't like that early Lost document got leaked.
Yes.
It showed you guys with a totally different plan than you ended up with.
Right.
But you can't quite go to a network and go, you have to trust us. This room can take care of this problem, even though we don't know where it's actually going.
Right. I mean, and the thing is, I don't think we can hold our storytellers to a higher standard than we hold, say, the President of the United States, who's basically like, guys, healthcare is a mess. Like, we can all acknowledge that it's highly problematic. I am now offering a solution to that mess, and this is what the plan's going to be, and I think this plan will work. And then he develops that plan, and there are people who resist that plan, and by the time that plan actually gets implemented, it's not exactly the plan that he wanted it to be, which allows him to say, well, if you would let me do the plan that I wanted to do, it probably would have worked better for you, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is we're not doing any of this in a vacuum. I mean, we are creating these things. If you're a novelist, the story begins and ends with you. It's you and your typewriter or your word processor or your laptop, and you have complete and total control over your universe, and no one but, it's as pure as it is. You've basically written it all by yourself. But when you're making a movie or a TV show, you have to collaborate with hundreds of people, and then you have to go get somebody to pay for it.
Right.
And that person is, guess what? They're going to have opinions, and you have to honor those opinions, not just because they're paying for it, but because a lot of the time they're smart. And so
they got where they are because they're smart.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the really good ones, like Vince, well, before it even goes to the network, before AMC gets to weigh on it, the writer's room itself is the jury room. And every single person in that room is going to take turns being Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men, where you're juror number 8, and you're the one person who has to convince everybody else in the room to do it this way. And the minute that you reach consensus, that's when you can then take the idea out into the outside world and field test it.
So you've been working right now on Leftovers. How many scripts have you got? How many episodes have you guys worked on?
So we started about 5 weeks ago, and we've spent about 3 weeks just talking about the architecture of the first season, and in the process of doing that, we talk about the architecture of the series as a whole, but just like large, long-form character arcs, and mostly talking a lot about the characters. Who is this person? What do they want? What was their life prior to the moment that we met them? And what is the trajectory of their life moving forwards? And we spent 3 weeks doing that.
And that's all up for discussion.
It's all up for discussion. I mean, obviously we have a book to talk about,
right.
That there's some basis for these things, but then there are characters that we created solely for the series that are, are newborns with potential to go anywhere and do anything. And then in the 2 weeks following that period, we essentially broke the first episode, and are in the process of breaking the second episode, which will be the second and third episodes respectively, because we already shot the pilot. So after 5 weeks, we have no scripts to show for it,
right.
but a real large design.
And the breaks, one of the writers will take those and hammer them into a script?
Yeah, I mean, the plan is, because this is a wonderful thing, that when Carlton and I were doing Lost, in the first year was 25 episodes, second year was 24, third year was 23. Then there was a writer's
8 days for the script or something?
So we're only doing 10 episodes of The Leftovers. So I'm actually thinking that I would like to write most of, if not all of them, but in collaboration with other writers.
Right.
So Tom and I wrote the pilot together. I'll write the second episode with one of the other writers, the third episode with one of the other writers, and so forth. So I'll be co-writing the entire season, because I think that that's actually possible with 10, and not want to die.
Now, have you and Tom come to interesting differences or learned things from each other about your different approaches to character as you sat and wrote the pilot?
I wouldn't say differences of opinion in so much as...
I'm just thinking difference of approach.
Right, yeah. Well, he's a novelist, first and foremost, so I think that the idea of, first off, allowing his baby to be raised by others is something that I'm not entirely sure that I'd ever be capable of. And ultimately, and very quickly, I realized that won't work for him. It'll only work if he's raising the baby with us. Right. So Tom has been enormously collaborative. He and I obviously wrote the pilot together, but then once we hired the writers, he's been a fixture in the writer's room as well. And so he's part of the team that is basically making the show. And at any, yes, ultimately, I'm the showrunner, so I'm the one who's going like this or like that. But if I say something and there's let's say there's 6 other writers in the room other than me, if 2 of them are like, that's awesome, and the other 4 are like, I'm doing everything I can to get those other 4 on board. And it doesn't mean that every idea has to be unanimous. Now, sometimes I'm in that role because I'm the showrunner, but sometimes that's Parada. So he'll pitch an idea, and then suddenly now he's that guy who basically has to win over the room. So at any given time, sort of the focus shifts, and ultimately passion wins, which is like, if you're really passionate about an idea and you think it's great, you'll do almost everything to sort of convince the room of your brilliance, because you know it in your heart. But if you can't convince them that it's brilliant, then it's going to die on the vine. And it's an excruciatingly... terrifying process.
Litmus test.
It's not for everyone, and it's very humbling. Because you want to come into these things thinking, I'm gonna take a risk. Here's an idea that I'm really passionate about, and I know that it's great, but I don't know how to convince everybody that it's great. And there's a lot of fear attached to that. And anger is just is a mask for fear. Yeah. Every time I've ever been angry in my life, it's because I was, scared of something or sad about something. Yeah. And so that's what every time you pitch, you're becoming vulnerable to rejection, which is scary and sad. And so if someone basically says that's the worst idea I've ever heard, your knee-jerk response is to say, go fuck yourself, but you have to move through that parabola and then work together. So Tom and I think, are very like-minded. He was a huge fan of Lost. I'm a huge fan of all of his writing. And when I read this book, I was like, this is going to be the next TV show that I want to be a part of. And I hadn't felt that way about anything during or after Lost, prior to reading The Leftovers.
So is it still, given that you are both a showrunner and a producer and a writer, and that with JJ, you guys have built a sort of cadre of producer writers who are really making some amazing things. Is it less true now that film is a director's medium and television is the writer's medium? That's the bifurcation that a lot of people talk about. The writer has been classically shoved by the wayside in the film industry.
Sure.
The story of the writer who doesn't get to see his vision fulfilled is just ad nauseum. But
yes.
Is that becoming less true now, that people understand that's more critical, that the writer participate in the process on a deeper level? Or is that...
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for Vince Gilligan to write a movie, that he's not going to direct, because that movie would not be a Vince Gilligan movie. It would be whoever was directing that movie, in the same way that, and all the writing that I've done in film, and this isn't, this is for my successes and my failures, is I was helping the director realize their vision, which at times was very challenging for me, having come from Lost, where Carlton and I were really the auteurs of that show. So I want to punch myself in the face while wearing a beret for even using the word auteur. But I think that's what you're talking about, which is essentially like it's a pure presentation of vision, in the way that it's very rare where you have something like Social Network, which is, it feels like it's an Aaron Sorkin movie. It also feels like a David Fincher movie. Right. And that's a case of Fincher saying, I'm shooting Sorkin's script. This makes sense to me. And you try to find that alignment. So it's possible for one writer to write something, and then the director figures out a way to execute that. And I think in the case of The Leftovers, for example, when HBO first said, when I first came in, and they asked me, how do you see this show? I was like, well, there's definitely going to be Lost in there, because that's what drives me. But it also feels like it's going to be much more realistic than Lost was. There was something sort of, hyper real about Lost, or supernatural about Lost, that it embraced. The genre tropes of the mysterious island show, whereas The Leftovers, even though it's got this huge supernatural premise, so it's kind of like if Lost met Friday Night Lights and they had a baby, and then that baby was severely neglected, and so and so the natural instinct was to go and get Peter Berg, who wrote and directed the movie Friday Night Lights and the pilot Friday Night Lights. That series I'm a huge fan of.
Amazing.
Pete was obviously the author of the pilot, but then Jason Katims came in and was basically the author of the series, with, by Pete's own admission, very, very minimal creative influence by Pete. So the pilot and the series are both the same and different, but Jason Katims is the one who did it. And in the same way, Peter Berg became sort of the third creative influencer on The Leftovers pilot between Parada and myself. So it started with Tom, who basically wrote this novel. I came in, worked with Tom, adapted the novel into the pilot script, and then Pete came in and executed his vision of that script.
Right.
And we got this very sort of organic thing that is, in my opinion, 1,000 times better than anything that I could have generated by myself.
Well, so as I'm thinking about this, the trope of the writer getting his vision neglected while the director gets what he wants, it's based on the idea that the more power you have, the more you get to exercise your own ego. But if there's something that typifies what you've talked about in just countless interviews about writing and about collaborating, is that for you, it's really about putting the ego to the side and letting the ethos of the project take over.
Yeah, if I can be mega pretentious for a second, I would say it's exorcising versus exercising, for me, which is you have to have a strong ego, because if you don't know what you want, every time you get to an intersection, it'll be a conversation about whether you should turn left or right. And so, but ultimately it should be about you getting to an intersection and saying, I want to go left. And then your collaborator says, well, I really want to go right now. And then in TV, you have to convince them to turn left. In features, you have to make right make sense for you, because they're going right whether you like it or not.
Right. But I mean, you said that on Star Trek, if you guys might even be on set filming a scene and realizing that it's not working, and sit there and kind of work it out.
Right.
That seems like a giant amount of stakes to place on just a few guys trying to figure that out, but that's beautiful that happens right there.
Yeah, and the more work you do up front on the script, the less likely that is to happen. But for Trek, particularly because we are doing a sequel, the actors are now really invested in the characters. So even Chris Pine and Zach Quino or Zoe Saldana are saying, hey, look, we read the script and we really, really dug the script, but now that the scene's actually on its feet, I have some questions for you. Help us understand what it is you want from us. That's what they're saying to JJ. And then JJ will then turn to Bob or Alex or myself and then say, like, hey, I'm including you in this conversation now. And if we can't adequately answer the actor's challenge, we have to change.
Right.
And as we should.
Yeah. It's Jamie and I have a thing that when we're working together that we will argue every single point, almost as just that's our method.
But you're always right.
No, not at all. That's the thing is that...
Well, that's not what you told me.
Okay,
he did.
Right.
He did. He was very drunk.
He'll say we can use string, and I'll say we could use duct tape, and he'll say we can use rope, and we'll go back and forth. But there's a certain point at which somebody says, zip ties, and everyone just stops, because when the right solution shows up, if you're really paying attention, it's really clear.
Correct, and you've just illustrated the lesson that I have to learn over and over and over and over and over again, which is when you can't reach consensus, neither idea is the right idea. You have to mutually reach the third idea.
Right.
And that's why I think so many movies and TV shows are kind of can end up being shitty, which is, it does become about a gavel bang in terms of the decision-making process, as opposed to the much more time-consuming process, which is collaboration is very time-consuming.
It's exhausting.
It's why the divorce rate is so high.
Yeah.
There are all these reasons, because it's exhausting, but ultimately it's highly rewarding and always yields the This isn't to say like groupthink is the best thing, because there is also something to be said for purity of vision. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the if you're making a movie, you don't get to say like, this movie is directed by me, written by me, starring me,
right,
and I'm going to John Malkovich it, I'm going to play every role.
Yeah.
That said, like when Woody Allen was doing that, it's pretty incredible to behold.
Louis C.K.
Yeah, Louis C.K. The uncompromised, pure vision of normally the network's coming in and saying, why is your wife African American and you have white kids? Like, and FX is not saying that.
Well, and
clearly.
even he is really clear.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, no, I have total creative control until I screw it up.
Right.
I want to do right by them. I don't want to only do what I want to do. I want to make a show that they like, and we all win Emmys for it. And
right.
he's very clear that it is a collaboration with the network. He's
Yes.
not the lone artist against the machine.
Correct, but he's baking that stuff by himself and on his own terms, and that is a beautiful thing. You have to be super talented, super confident, and you have to have made a lot of mistakes to arrive at that point in terms of yourself, where you can say like, hey, this could be a complete and total disaster, but I've done it the other way. I've done the laugh track HBO sitcom.
Yeah. Right.
And that didn't work, so now I'm doing it this way. And I do. Maybe this is just a way of feeling better about my failures, but I do think that I'm really, really grateful for the mistakes that I've made and the failures that I've made, because it gives me when I start to feel myself doing the same things that led to those failures, they're familiar to me now when they weren't before. And it's sort of like, wait a minute, what's that feeling that oh, that's right. That was right before I really fucked up royally. I should not do that again. You know?
I've always said that a craftsperson is not someone who doesn't fail. They fail just as much as you do and in all the same ways. They can just smell them coming from farther off.
That's right.
And they can kind of get out of the way and let them go past.
Absolutely.
So it occurs to me that in addition to the skills you've gotten as a showrunner, as a producer, executive producer, and a writer, you also have this other skill, which is convincing the people with money in the room to go with the vision that you have or that you're representing on behalf of the team.
Yeah, sometimes and sometimes not. I mean, a lot of the time, thank goodness, it's a show and tell, where you don't. I think I'd be terrified if I just got the trust right out of the gate. And one of the reasons that I was so drawn to HBO in general was, it's the gold standard. I still believe that it is. This isn't to say that they're the best network of all networks out there. This is a completely and totally subjective idea. Just the programming on HBO is what was the beginning of, oh my God, wow, you can do that. And that isn't to say that there weren't shows before it, like Hill Street or on broadcast, that were a huge part of me realizing what was possible on television. But The Sopranos is really the beginning, and that show in sort of conjunction with Sex and the City, which I have no shame in saying I loved and recognized for what it was, which was this hugely innovative idea that HBO birthed. I was like, but HBO only has one night of programming, Sunday nights. They have 2 hours of prime, so they're not impressed by me. They don't care that I'm one of the co-creators of Lost. I have to basically go sing for my supper, and they're not even going to order my series. I have to go and write a pilot and convince them to make that pilot based on the qualitative merit of that pilot, because they option the leftovers, but they option hundreds of books. Yeah. And so I've got to write this pilot that they have enough faith in to make into a show, and then I'm just going to be able to shoot an hour-long version of it, and then they can kill it there. Like, HBO made The Corrections as a pilot, which is one of the greatest, sort of most lauded, novels in contemporary literature, and they didn't pick it up. Right. So I'm sort of like, this is great. Like, I'm going to put myself in this scenario where I really have to kind of get everything right in order to be able to get to make 10 episodes. And then there's brilliant shows on HBO like Enlightened that after 2 seasons, they don't order a 3rd season because you couldn't get people to watch it. So now that I've got HBO to believe in me, now I have to get the audience to basically sign on for the journey too. And the fear should be really present, but now it's just exciting for me because it's not like, hey, I proved myself. If I fail, I fail. I need desperately to succeed, but I love skiing the black diamond.
I mean,
I don't even ski. That's the hard one, right? Yeah.
I don't either. I did it once.
Yeah, we don't. We're not skiers. God's sake, look at us.
I was skiing, and it was in Telluride, and they'd given me a guy to mind me.
Oh,
and I fall really well, so I was falling and having
just the fact that you call him a ski minder versus a The
thing is I realized after the 3rd time I fell, and I was like laughing hysterically, sliding down the slope, and I looked up and I saw the look on his face, and I realized I am ruining this guy's day.
Right.
Someone woke him up and said, "Don't let Adam get hurt." And I got to the bottom, and I was like, "I think I'm done today." And I watched him go.
So body relaxed, yes.
So no more skiing.
Yeah,
but
no more minding for you.
Film school is full of teaching everybody all the mechanics of film, but that skill about being able to prep for, there's countless books and interviews about how the suits don't understand the vision, and they
don't even wear suits anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
But being able to prepare for that meeting, being able to talk to people across that gulf and convince them, that is in and of itself a really important skill.
It doesn't feel like one. It feels like
an extension of the other.
Well, I mean, it's essentially being able to sit down in a room and to understand what your job is in that room, and and I think that,
and not to be precious about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits that I had of despite my very prestigious film degree from NYU was my roommate and I decided when we graduated that we were going to move out to LA. from New York because this is where the industry was. If you want to make cars, you move to Detroit. Maybe not so much anymore, but it was sort of like, hey, we want to be in the film business, let's move out to LA. But as opposed to saying, we're going to write screenplays because we're 21 years old, like we just said, we're going to work in LA for like 5 years. That's going to be our grad school. It's going to be our paid internship. And then we'll start trying to actually make stuff. That was sort of our pact. And I came out here with that attitude of, I'm not going to be paid to write things until I'm in my late 20s. And I feel like that was a key part of evolving towards what you said, which is, if you're ever going to understand what the guy on the other side of the room is thinking, you've got to be that guy.
Right.
You've got to, and I keep saying guy, or we keep saying the dudes, but obviously many incredibly powerful and talented women were just as instrumental in teaching me how to get to this place. But when I came out here, I worked for 5 years in the business for an agency, for Paramount Studios, for a production company on the other side of writers. And I just kept, so I was reading screenplays, both great screenplays and terrible screenplays. This was my, Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hour rule, where it's sort of like, what separates the ones that sell from the ones that don't sell? But then more importantly, like being in those rooms and understanding, like, these writers are interviewing for jobs. In an actor, it's very clear that you're auditioning. Right. Writers didn't seem to understand that what got them in the room was their writing, but what got them the job was what they said in the room. They only have 45 minutes to do that. And, the strength of your idea is interchangeable with the other 9 writers who are going to come in and pitch. But what's really important is that you show a collaborative spirit and that you understand that your job is to help, is to identify who's the vision in the room, and then service them.
I'm curious about why Iron Man. Why does it say thank you from Favreau? What's that for?
I'm not at liberty to know.
You're not at liberty to say.
This is one of those cases where you say, like, I don't want to answer that question because, no, I'm taking you through my thinking. If I say I don't want to answer that question,
that is
you'll just intuit that I actually secretly wrote Iron Man,
no,
which is not at all the case. I wrote a draft of Cowboys and Aliens amongst like 17 other writers, only I think 10 of which ended up getting credited, in between the 3rd and 4th season of Lost. And Alex Kurtzman and Bob Orsi, who I worked with on just the first Star Trek at that point, but was good friends with. They were the producers of the movie at that point. And essentially, we worked together on a draft of Cowboys and Aliens, and that when there was no director attached. And that draft that we wrote got Jon Favreau attached. And just as he came on and started developing the material, I went back to Lost. But at that same time, Jon was posting Iron Man 2. We got to hang out in the editing room with him a bit because we were desperate to see what he was up to on Iron Man 2. Yeah. And there was no Cowboys and Aliens paraphernalia to send, so he sent me the Iron Man bust.
Very nice.
Which I talk to all the time.
I've got a set of unfinished fiberglass Iron Man armor. The Mark III.
Do you put it on?
I have. It's like I said, it's unfinished.
Yes.
But it's something I want to.
You're not answering my question. Do you put it on?
Yeah, I have put it on.
Okay. There's no judgment here. This is a safe place.
I do feel like this is a very safe place. Damon, thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for sitting down with me and coming to my office.
Oh, C.K. Dexter Haven!